The whip cracked across Jonas's back with a sound like splitting wood. He did not cry out. He had learned years ago that screaming only fed the hunger in Master Calloway's eyes, only made the leather bite deeper. Instead, he pressed his lips together until they went white, tasted copper on his tongue and counted. 1, 2, 3. The numbers were a lifeline in the ocean of pain, something to hold on to when his body wanted to break apart. 4, 5, 6. The overseer's breathing grew ragged with effort, but Jonas's silence was absolute. It was the only thing they had not taken from him yet. If this story moves you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you untold histories of resistance and survival. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Maryland in 1854 was a place where the air itself seemed complicit in cruelty. The Calloway plantation sprawled across 300 acres of tobacco fields, each furrow carved by hands that would never profit from the harvest. The Chesapeake Bay was 15 miles to the east, close enough that on certain mornings the wind carried the salt smell of the water, a reminder of the vast world that existed beyond the borders of bondage. But for Jonas and the 37 other enslaved people who worked this land, the bay might as well have been an ocean away. Their world was measured in rows of tobacco, in the distance from cabin to field to cabin again, in the narrow strip of existence between dawn and darkness. Jonas had been born on this land 28 years earlier, delivered by his mother in a cabin so small you could touch both walls at once. She had named him Jonas, after the man in the Bible who was swallowed by the whale and survived. "For you got to survive too," she had whispered to him when he was old enough to understand. "No matter what swallows you up, you got to come out the other side." She had died when he was 12, worked to death in those same tobacco fields, her body giving out during the harvest season, when the days stretched from before sunrise to well past sunset. Jonas had been there when it happened, had seen her simply stop moving, her hands going slack around the tobacco leaves she had been stripping. She had looked at him once, tried to speak, and then folded into the earth like she was always meant to return to it. Jonas had inherited her cabin, her silence, and her desperate hope that survival was a form of victory. But he had also inherited something else, something she had tried to hide from the overseers and from Master Calloway, the ability to read. His mother had been taught by the previous plantation owner's daughter, a sickly girl who had died young, but who had seen something human in the young enslaved woman who brought her meals. Those lessons had been passed to Jonas in whispers, traced letters in the dirt floor, stolen moments with a Bible that had belonged to his grandmother. By the time Jonas was 15, he could read better than most of the poor whites in the county. He kept this knowledge buried deep, knowing that literacy in an enslaved person was considered dangerous, a threat to the natural order of things. Master Richard Calloway was not the worst of them, which made him all the more dangerous. He did not rave or foam at the mouth like some of the neighboring planters. He did not take enslaved women to his bed or beat people for sport. He was methodical, precise, calculating. He kept ledgers where he recorded every infraction, every punishment, every dollar lost or gained from the labor extracted from human flesh. Jonas appeared in those ledgers more than anyone else on the plantation, not because he was rebellious in the obvious ways. He did not run, did not talk back, did not break tools or slow his pace. His rebellion was quieter and therefore more infuriating to a man like Calloway. Jonas looked him in the eye. When addressed, Jonas would meet his gaze for just a fraction of a second too long before lowering his head. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible to anyone who was not looking for it, but Calloway noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed the way Jonas stood straighter than the others, the way he moved through the fields with a kind of dignity that should have been beaten out of him years ago. He noticed that the other enslaved people looked to Jonas, that when there was a dispute in the quarters, Jonas was the one who settled it. This was intolerable to Calloway, not because it caused problems, but because it suggested that there was a parallel structure of authority on his plantation, one that he did not control. The tobacco fields stretched out in endless rows, the broad green leaves drinking in the brutal summer sun. Jonas moved through them with mechanical efficiency, his hands knowing the work without thought. Pinch the hornworms off the leaves, the fat green caterpillars that could destroy an entire plant if left unchecked. Check for rot, the brown spots that spread like disease. Sucker the plants, removing the small shoots that grew between the main stem and the branches, so all the plant's energy went into the leaves that would eventually be cured, hung in the barn and sold at the Baltimore market for prices that Jonas would never know. Around him, 30 other enslaved people worked in similar silence, their songs forbidden this season after one of them had sung a verse that Calloway decided had hidden meaning. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the shuffle of feet in dirt, the rustle of tobacco leaves, and the occasional bark of an order from Samuel, the overseer. Samuel was a poor white man who had failed at his own farm, lost it to debt and drink, and now took out his bitterness on people who could not fight back. He was a small man, with a face that had been weathered by sun and meanness into something that looked older than his 35 years. He carried a whip on his belt and a pistol tucked into his waistband, and he used both with a casual cruelty that suggested he enjoyed his work more than he should. Jonas's wife, Ruth, worked 3 rows over. He could see the curve of her back, the careful movement of her hands as she inspected each plant. They had been married for 5 years, married in the slave way without papers or permission, jumping the broom in the quarters while the others sang softly and kept watch for patrols. Master Calloway tolerated slave marriages because they kept people stable, kept them from running. A man with a wife was less likely to flee. A woman with children was bound to the plantation by ties stronger than any chain. Ruth was younger than Jonas by 4 years, with eyes that had somehow retained a spark of something that could only be called hope. She believed they might see freedom one day. She whispered about the North Star, about people who helped runaways, about a place called Canada, where slavery was illegal and where black people could own land and vote and testify in court. She had heard these stories from a woman named Dinah who had since died, and Dinah had heard them from her son who had run and made it, or so the whispered rumor said. Ruth clung to these stories like lifelines. Jonas loved her for that hope, even as he could not share it. He had seen too many people try to run. He had seen them brought back with dogs at their heels, their clothes torn, their bodies broken. He had seen what happened afterward, the whippings that went on until the person could no longer stand, the sails south to the cotton plantations of Georgia and Alabama, where the work was harder and the life expectancy shorter. Hope was a luxury he could not afford. Hope was dangerous. It made you careless. But Ruth kept hoping anyway, and in the quiet moments when they lay together in their cabin at night, she would trace the scars on his back with gentle fingers and tell him stories about a woman named Harriet who had escaped slavery and then came back again and again to lead others to freedom. Stories about a place called Philadelphia, where there were free black people who had never been enslaved, who ran businesses and owned homes. Stories about resistance that took 1,000 forms, some loud and some silent. Jonas would listen and say nothing, but something in him shifted with each word she spoke, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, layer upon layer, waiting for the right current to stir it up. He did not believe in her vision of escape, but he believed in her. And that belief was enough to make him wonder, in the darkest part of the night, whether survival really was the only option. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in late August. The heat was murderous, the kind that made the air shimmer and turned the horizon into a wavering mirage. Jonas had been working since dawn, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat, his hands raw from the rough tobacco leaves. He was heading to the well for water during the brief midday break when he heard the sound, a cry. Sharp and afraid, he turned and saw Ruth on the ground, Samuel standing over her. The overseer's face was flushed red, his hand raised. "You'll speak when I tell you to speak," Samuel snarled. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Jonas did not think. Thinking was too slow. His body moved before his mind could catch up, covering the distance between them in seconds. He stepped between Ruth and Samuel, his body a wall. His silence suddenly transformed into something that felt like thunder about to break. Up close, he could smell the whiskey on Samuel's breath, could see the broken veins in his nose. The overseer had been drinking, which made him even more unpredictable than usual. "Get out of the way, boy," Samuel said, but his voice had a tremor in it now. Jonas did not move. He could feel Ruth behind him, could hear her breathing, quick and scared. For 3 heartbeats, 4, 5, they stood there. The other workers had stopped to watch, frozen in that terrible space between fear and anticipation. Then Samuel made his mistake. He shoved Jonas. Not hard, but hard enough to send a message, to reassert the hierarchy that Jonas's presence had disrupted. And Jonas, in that moment, made his choice. He shoved back. The moment his hands made contact with the white man's chest, the world tilted. Samuel stumbled backward, more from shock than force, his mouth falling open. "You put your hands on me," he said, and his voice was almost wondering. "You put your hands on me." Jonas knew what he had done. Every person watching knew what he had done. in the hierarchy of the plantation, in the laws of Maryland, in the unwritten rules that kept the entire system functioning. What Jonas had just done carried only one penalty: death, or something close to it. An enslaved person who struck a white person had committed an unforgivable crime. It did not matter that Samuel had been threatening Ruth. It did not matter that Jonas had been protecting his wife. The only thing that mattered was that the natural order had been violated. Master Calloway was summoned from the house. He came striding across the field, his shadow long in the afternoon sun, and the crowd of enslaved workers parted before him like water. He was a tall man, lean and hard, with grey threading through his dark hair. He wore a white linen suit that stayed impossibly clean despite the dust and heat. He listened to Samuel's account, his face unreadable, his grey eyes moving from the overseer to Jonas to Ruth and back again. Then he looked at Jonas with something that might have been disappointment or might have been satisfaction. There was almost a hint of relief in his expression, as if Jonas had finally given him the excuse he had been waiting for. "You know what has to happen now," Calloway said quietly. His voice was calm, almost gentle. That was the most terrifying thing about him. Jonas nodded once. He would not beg. "Tree," Calloway said, and gestured toward the old oak at the edge of the field, the one with the low, strong branches, the one they used for this purpose. The whipping tree. Everyone knew it. Everyone feared it. They tied Jonas's wrists to the branch with rough hemp rope, his arms stretched above his head, his toes barely touching the ground. The position was designed to maximize pain, to make every muscle strain, to make the body a taut canvas for the whip. Calloway himself brought out the whip, not trusting this to Samuel. It was his best whip, the one with 9 tails, each tail tipped with a small piece of metal. The assembled enslaved people were forced to watch. That was part of the punishment, the spectacle, the reminder of what happened when you forgot your place. Ruth stood in the front, her face rigid with the effort of not showing emotion. Jonas found her eyes and held them. If he was going to survive this, he needed something to anchor to. The first lash took his breath. The second made his vision white out. The pain was immediate and total, a fire that consumed every other sensation. By the 10th lash, the skin on his back had split open. By the 20th, he had retreated somewhere deep inside himself to a place where the pain was distant, where he was watching from above, where his mother's voice whispered, "Survive, survive, survive." He counted because counting gave him control. 25, 30, 35. Each number was a small victory, proof that he was still conscious, still alive, still himself. At 40 lashes, Calloway stopped. Jonas hung from the branch, his back a ruin of torn flesh and blood. They cut him down and he collapsed into the dust. Ruth was there immediately, her hands on him, and old Moses too, and they half carried him back to the cabin, while the other workers returned silently to the fields. That night, as Ruth cleaned his wounds with water and strips of cloth, as the pain screamed through every nerve, Jonas made a decision. It formed in him like ice forming on a pond, starting at the edges and spreading inward until it was solid and unbreakable. He would not die here. He would not let them grind him down to nothing. Survival was not enough anymore. His mother had been wrong about that. Surviving was not victory if you survived as something less than human. Living free was victory. And if he could not live free, then he would die making sure that Master Calloway understood what it meant to be on the other end of the whip. "We have to run," Ruth whispered, reading his face in the dim light. Jonas shook his head slowly, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his torn back. "Not yet," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not yet." Ruth looked at him with something like fear. She knew that tone. The cabin was barely 12 feet square, its walls chinked with mud and moss. A small fire burned in the hearth. Through the cracks in the walls, Jonas could hear the night sounds of the quarters. Low voices, a baby crying, the creak of wood settling. "What are you planning?" Ruth asked. Jonas closed his eyes. The seeds of resistance Ruth had planted with her stories, the sediment that had been settling in him year after year, had suddenly crystallized into something hard and sharp and clear. "I'm planning to teach a man a lesson," he said softly. "A lesson about what it means to be human, about what it means to have your humanity stripped away." Ruth's hands stilled on his back. "Jonas," she said, warning in her voice, "whatever you're thinking—" "I'm thinking," he interrupted, "that Master Calloway needs to understand something. He needs to understand that we are not animals, that we feel, that we remember, that we can hate just as deeply as we can love." Outside, the night deepened. The stars came out, including the North Star that Ruth had taught him to find. But Jonas was not looking north. Not yet. First, there was something he needed to do, something that had been building in him for 28 years. The whipping had not broken him. It had freed something in him. Something dangerous. The days that followed the whipping moved like molasses, thick and slow and suffocating. Jonas could not work for a week. His back was a landscape of agony, the torn flesh weeping and crusting, each movement pulling at the wounds until he had to bite down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming. Ruth tended him with a devotion that bordered on desperation, washing the wounds with water boiled with oak bark to prevent infection, applying poultices made from herbs that old Moses brought from his secret garden behind the quarters. The old man knew plants the way Jonas knew anger, intimately, completely, with a knowledge that ran deeper than words. Master Calloway came to check on his investment on the third day. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, his figure blocking the afternoon light, and looked down at Jonas lying face down on the corn husk mattress. "You'll heal," he said matter-of-factly. "You're strong, always have been. That's why I paid good money for your mother all those years ago, and why I kept you when I could have sold you south." He paused as if expecting gratitude. When none came, he continued, "But you need to understand something, Jonas. There are rules here, rules that keep everyone safe. When you break those rules, people get hurt. You see that now, don't you?" Jonas said nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on the rough wooden wall, counting the knots in the timber. 1, 2, 3, Calloway sighed, the sound of a patient man dealing with a stubborn child. "Samuel wants you sold," he said. "Wants you sent down to Mississippi where they know how to handle troublesome niggers. But I told him no. You're too valuable. You know this land. You work hard when you're not being foolish. So I'm giving you another chance. But Jonas," and here his voice dropped, became almost intimate, "there won't be a third chance. Next time. I let Samuel have his way, you understand?" Jonas understood. He understood that Calloway saw him as livestock that had briefly gone mad, that needed correction but was worth keeping. He understood that in Calloway's mind, the whipping had resolved the matter, had restored the natural order of things. He understood that Calloway believed Jonas would heal and return to work, and continue as before, perhaps a little more broken, a little more compliant. What Calloway did not understand was that something fundamental had shifted. The whipping had not broken Jonas. It had clarified him. Ruth understood, though. She saw it in the way Jonas's eyes tracked Calloway as the master left the cabin. She saw it in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands clenched and unclenched even as his back screamed in protest. "Whatever you're planning," she whispered after Calloway's footsteps had faded, "it's going to get you killed. It's going to get both of us killed." Jonas finally looked at her. "We're already dead," he said quietly. "We've been dead since the day we were born into this. The only question is whether we die on our knees or on our feet." By the second week, Jonas could move without wanting to scream. The wounds on his back had begun to close, though they would scar, adding to the map of violence already written on his skin. Old Moses had done his work well. There was no infection, no fever. Jonas's body was healing, but his mind was elsewhere, working through the problem that had consumed him since the moment the whip had first fallen. He began to watch, to observe, to note patterns he had never paid attention to before. Master Calloway's routines became a subject of intense study. Every morning at 6, Calloway would emerge from the main house and walk the perimeter of the plantation, checking on the tobacco fields, the barn, the slave quarters. He carried no weapon during these walks. He believed his authority was weapon enough. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he rode into town for business, taking Samuel with him, leaving the plantation under the supervision of his wife, Abigail, a frail woman who rarely left the house and who spoke to the enslaved people in a high, nervous voice that suggested she was more afraid of them than they were of her. Every Saturday evening, Calloway would sit on his porch with a glass of bourbon and a book, reading as the sun set. He enjoyed this ritual, this moment of civilization in the midst of his agricultural empire. Jonas had seen him do it for years without really seeing it. Now he saw everything. The way Calloway was alone during those evenings, the way the porch was partially hidden from the main road by a stand of oak trees, the way the light from the house windows cast deep shadows across the yard, the way a man absorbed in reading might not notice someone approaching until it was too late. Jonas began to plan with the same methodical precision that Calloway brought to his ledgers. He thought about timing, about opportunity, about how to create a moment where the natural order of things could be inverted, where the man who held the whip could be made to feel what it was like to be on the receiving end. But this was not about killing. Jonas had thought about that, had imagined it in vivid detail during the worst nights of his recovery, but killing Calloway would accomplish nothing. It would bring the full weight of the law down on the plantation, would result in mass punishment, would likely end with Jonas hanged and Ruth sold away. No, this had to be something else. Something that would leave Calloway alive but changed, marked, haunted by the understanding that his power was not absolute, that the people he owned were capable of returning the violence he inflicted. Ruth knew something was coming. She had stopped trying to talk him out of it. Instead, she began to prepare in her own way. She gathered supplies for running, dried meat, hard bread, a second set of clothes hidden in a hollow tree at the edge of the woods. She studied the North Star every night, memorizing its position relative to other constellations. She talked to the other women in the quarters, carefully, obliquely, gathering information about routes north, about which roads were patrolled and which were not, about the names whispered in the community, conductors, safe houses, the Underground Railroad. If Jonas was going to do something that would force them to run, then she would make sure they had a chance of making it. 3 weeks after the whipping, Jonas returned to the fields. His back still ached, especially in the mornings when the scar tissue was tight, but he could work. The other enslaved people watched him warily, unsure of what to expect. Jonas had always been a leader among them, but now there was something different about him, something harder and colder. He did not speak of what had happened, but everyone had seen it. Everyone had been forced to watch. Samuel was nervous around him. The overseer kept his distance, barking orders from 20 feet away rather than getting close enough to be touched. He had started carrying a second pistol, tucked into the back of his belt where he could reach it quickly. Jonas noted this. He noted everything. The way Samuel's hand would drift to his weapons when Jonas was nearby. The way the other workers gave Jonas space, as if he carried something contagious. The way Master Calloway would pause sometimes when he saw Jonas, would study him with those grey eyes that missed nothing, trying to determine if his investment had truly been corrected, or if there was still rebellion simmering beneath the surface. There was, but Jonas had learned to hide it better than before. He lowered his eyes when Calloway looked at him. He worked steadily, efficiently, giving no cause for complaint. He was the model of the reformed slave, the broken horse that had been reminded of its place. And Calloway, seeing what he wanted to see, believed it. That was his mistake. He believed that pain was transformative, that 40 lashes were enough to break a man's spirit. He did not understand that sometimes pain does not break, it forges. September came, bringing cooler nights and the beginning of the harvest season. The tobacco had to be cut, hung in the curing barn, monitored constantly to ensure it dried properly without rotting. It was back-breaking work that left everyone exhausted, but it was also the busiest time of year, when even Calloway and Samuel were stretched thin, when routines were disrupted, when vigilance slipped just slightly. Jonas watched and waited. The moment was coming. He could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and electric. On a Thursday evening in mid-September, Calloway and Samuel rode to town for a meeting with the tobacco buyers. They would be gone until late, perhaps past midnight. Abigail Calloway was in bed with one of her frequent headaches, attended by the house slave, Cora. The overseer's assistant, a young white man named Tom, who was even less competent than Samuel, was supposedly watching the quarters, but Jonas had observed that Tom spent most of his evenings drinking corn whiskey behind the barn until he passed out. The plantation was as unguarded as it would ever be. Jonas waited until full dark. He kissed Ruth, told her to stay in the cabin no matter what she heard, and stepped out into the September night. The air smelled of curing tobacco and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and fell silent. Jonas moved through the darkness like water, silent and fluid, every sense heightened. He carried no weapon because he did not need one. His hands would be enough for what he planned. He made his way to the main house, avoiding the paths, moving through the shadows cast by the oak trees. A light burned in an upstairs window, Abigail's room. Downstairs was dark except for a single lamp in Calloway's study. Jonas circled to the back of the house, where the study window stood open to catch the evening breeze. Inside, he could see the desk where Calloway kept his ledgers, the shelves lined with books, the chair where the master sat to record the details of his empire. On the wall hung the whip, the same whip that had torn Jonas's back, the same whip that Calloway kept displayed like a trophy. Jonas had not come for the whip, not yet. First, there was something else he needed. He slipped through the window, his movements controlled and deliberate. The study smelled of tobacco and bourbon and leather. Jonas moved to the desk and began opening drawers, looking for what he knew must be there. In the third drawer, he found it. Calloway's personal journal. Not the plantation ledger, but the private book where Calloway recorded his thoughts, his observations, his justifications for the system he perpetuated. Jonas opened the journal and began to read. His mother's gift of literacy, hidden for so long, now served him. The entries were dated, organized, written in Calloway's careful hand. Jonas found the entry from the day of his whipping. Jonas proved rebellious today, putting his hands on Samuel in defense of his wife. Administered 40 lashes as correction. He is strong and took the punishment well. I believe he will be recovered and suitable for work within 10 days. Note, his attachment to the woman Ruth may be useful for controlling him in future. A man with something to lose is easier to manage than a man with nothing. Jonas read the words twice, 3 times, the clinical detachment of them, the calculation, the reduction of his love for Ruth, his desperate act to protect her, into a tool for management. He felt something cold settle in his chest, something that was beyond anger, beyond rage. It was clarity, pure and absolute clarity about what he was and what Calloway was, and what the distance between them really meant. He closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer. Then he took the whip from the wall. It was heavier than he expected, the handle worn smooth from use, the 9 tails hanging down like dead snakes. He coiled it carefully and tucked it into his belt. Then he left the study the way he had come, through the window, back into the September night. But Jonas did not return to the quarters. Instead, he made his way to the edge of the property, where an old hunting trail led into the woods. There, hidden among the trees, was something he had prepared over the past 2 weeks, during the brief moments when he could slip away unnoticed. A clearing, a single tree with low, strong branches, and rope. Jonas had learned carpentry from his mother, who had learned it from her father. He knew knots. He knew how to tie a rope so that it would hold weight, so that it would not slip, so that someone suspended from it would hang in exactly the position Jonas himself had hung from the whipping tree. He checked his work one more time, testing the knots, making sure everything was ready. Then he settled down to wait. Calloway and Samuel would return from town. They would ride past this spot on their way back to the plantation. The trail was the shortest route from the main road. Jonas knew this because he had watched them take it 100 times. He knew that Calloway always rode slightly ahead, that Samuel usually dozed in his saddle after drinking in town. He knew that in the darkness, with the trees close on either side, 2 men on horseback would not see a rope stretched across the path at chest height until it was too late. The hours passed. Jonas did not move. He had learned patience from the tobacco fields, from the long days of repetitive labor, from the years of swallowing his rage. Patience was another thing they had taught him without meaning to. Finally, near midnight, he heard the sound of horses on the trail. 2 riders moving slowly through the darkness. Jonas's hands tightened on the rope he held. The riders came closer. He could hear Samuel's voice, slurred with drink, complaining about the tobacco prices. Calloway's response, curt and dismissive. Closer. The moment stretched out, infinite and crystalline. Then Jonas pulled the rope taut. The rope caught Calloway across the chest with the force of a horizontal thunderbolt. One moment he was upright in the saddle, and the next he was flying backward, his body hitting the ground with a sound like a sack of grain dropped from a height. His horse reared and bolted. Samuel, half asleep and drunk, did not even have time to register what had happened before his own mount panicked and threw him. The overseer landed hard on his shoulder and lay there, groaning, trying to understand why the world had suddenly turned violent. Jonas was on Calloway before the man could draw breath. He moved with a speed born of necessity, of years of suppressed violence, suddenly unleashed in controlled fury. He dragged Calloway to his feet, one hand wrapped in the man's collar, and pushed him stumbling toward the clearing he had prepared. Calloway tried to speak, tried to command, tried to summon the authority that had always protected him, but Jonas struck him across the face, once, hard, and the words died in a spray of blood from split lips. Samuel was crawling toward where his pistol had fallen, his left arm hanging useless from the damaged shoulder. Jonas kicked the weapon away into the underbrush, then kicked Samuel in the ribs for good measure. The overseer curled into a ball, whimpering. "Stay down," Jonas said, and his voice carried such cold finality that Samuel obeyed instantly, terror overriding pain. In the clearing, lit by pale moonlight filtering through the oak branches, Jonas bound Calloway's wrists with the rope he had prepared. The master fought, tried to pull away, but Jonas was stronger and had the advantage of surprise and rage and 28 years of accumulated grievance. He forced Calloway's arms up and tied his wrists to the branch, stretched overhead, toes barely touching the ground, the exact position, the exact tree he had constructed for this exact purpose. Calloway found his voice then. "You're a dead man," he gasped. "Do you understand that? You're dead. They'll hunt you down. They'll hang you in the town square. Jonas stuffed a rag into his mouth, cutting off the threats. He stepped back and looked at his work. Master Richard Calloway, plantation owner, respected member of the community, hung from a tree like a common criminal. Like property, like an object to be corrected. Jonas pulled the whip from his belt. Calloway's whip, the one that had decorated his study wall, the one that had torn Jonas's back 3 weeks earlier. He let the 9 tails uncoil, let them drag in the dirt. Calloway's eyes went wide above the gag. He shook his head frantically, made muffled sounds of protest. Jonas felt nothing, no satisfaction, no joy, just that cold, clear certainty that what he was about to do was necessary, that it was the only language this man would understand. "You wrote in your journal," Jonas said quietly, "that I took the punishment well, that I was strong. Let's see how strong you are." The first lash caught Calloway across the back, and the man's entire body convulsed. His scream was muffled by the gag, but audible enough. Jonas waited, counting in his head. 1, 2, 3. Then the second lash. Calloway's expensive shirt tore like paper. The third lash drew blood. By the 5th, Calloway was sobbing, his body jerking with each impact like a puppet with cut strings. Jonas counted to 10 and stopped. 10 lashes, not 40. Jonas was not trying to match the punishment he had received. He was trying to teach a lesson, and the lesson was this: pain is the same whether you are white or black, master or slave. The body does not care about social hierarchy when it is being torn apart. Suffering is the great equalizer. He stepped forward and removed the gag from Calloway's mouth. The man gasped for air, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he whispered, "please. I'll let you go. I'll give you papers. Jonas struck him across the face again, not hard, just enough to stop the words. "You think this is about freedom?" he asked. "You think I did this so you would free me?" He leaned in close enough to smell the fear sweat on Calloway's skin. "I did this so you would remember, so that every time you look at your back in the mirror, every time you feel those scars pull when you move, you'll remember that we are human, that we feel, that we are not animals you can correct with a whip. I want you to carry this with you. I want it to wake you up at night. I want you to understand finally what you've been doing to us." Calloway's eyes were wild, uncomprehending. He was a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered. Jonas cut him down, and Calloway collapsed to the ground, his ruined back exposed to the moonlight. Jonas stood over him for a moment, the whip still in his hand. Then he dropped it onto Calloway's chest. "Keep it," he said, "a reminder." He turned to Samuel, who was still curled in the dirt where Jonas had left him. "You go to the authorities. They'll ask questions. They'll want to know how you let a slave get the better of Master Calloway. They'll want to know where you were, what you were doing. They'll want to know why you didn't protect him. You think about that before you open your mouth. If you're still watching, this is the moment to leave a like and share this story. These histories of resistance need to be told and remembered. Drop a comment and let us know what you think about Jonas's choice." Jonas walked away, leaving both men in the clearing. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving behind something that felt like vertigo. He had just committed an act that, if discovered, would result in his death and likely the punishment of everyone on the plantation. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, but he felt no regret, only a strange, weightless sensation, as if he had been carrying something impossibly heavy for his entire life, and had finally set it down. He returned to the cabin where Ruth was waiting, her face tight with fear and anticipation. "It's done," he said simply. She did not ask for details. She just pulled him inside and began gathering the supplies she had hidden. "We have to go now," she said. "Tonight, before they find him, before they come for us." Jonas nodded. He had known this was the likely outcome. You do not strike a master and remain on his plantation. You do not invert the order of things and expect to survive in the same place. The act itself had been the point, but survival required flight. They had perhaps 3 hours before Calloway made it back to the plantation, before the alarm was raised, before the dogs were unleashed and the posses formed. They moved quickly, taking only what they could carry: a blanket, the food Ruth had saved, 2 canteens of water, a knife Jonas had stolen from the barn weeks ago. Ruth wore 2 dresses, one over the other, and had wrapped her head in a dark scarf. Jonas wore his sturdiest clothes and the shoes he had been saving, the ones with thick soles that might last 100 miles if he was lucky. They slipped out of the cabin and made their way to the edge of the plantation, avoiding the paths, moving through the tobacco fields where the broad leaves provided cover. Behind them, the quarters were dark and silent. The other enslaved people were asleep or pretending to be, and if any of them heard Jonas and Ruth leaving, they gave no sign. It was better not to know, better not to be implicated. At the edge of the property, Ruth stopped and looked back one last time. This had been her home, such as it was, for 9 years. Jonas did not look back. He had been born here, but it had never been home. Home was something you chose, something you built. Home was not a place where you could be whipped for defending your wife. They entered the woods. The North Star was visible through gaps in the canopy, steady and bright. Ruth took the lead, navigating by the celestial map she had memorized. They walked quickly but carefully, trying not to leave obvious tracks, trying not to break branches or disturb the undergrowth too much. Every few minutes they stopped to listen for sounds of pursuit, dogs, voices, horses, but there was nothing yet. Just the night sounds of the forest, owls, crickets, the rustle of small animals in the leaves. They walked for 3 hours, putting as much distance between themselves and the plantation as possible. Ruth had a general idea of the route north. They would need to cross into Pennsylvania, then continue to New York or further into Canada. It was hundreds of miles through hostile territory, where any white person they encountered could demand to see their papers, could turn them in for reward money, could shoot them on sight if they ran. The odds were not good, but the odds had never been good. The odds had been stacked against them from birth. As dawn approached, they found a creek and followed it upstream, walking in the water to confuse the dogs that would inevitably come. The water was cold and made their feet numb, but it was necessary. They walked in the creek for a mile, maybe more, until they found a dense thicket of blackberry bushes and laurel that formed a natural shelter. They pushed their way into the center of it, ignoring the thorns that tore at their clothes and skin, and collapsed in the small, hollow space inside. Jonas's back was screaming. The exertion of the night, the violence he had committed, had reopened some of the wounds. He could feel blood seeping through his shirt. Ruth saw it and wordlessly began to tend to him, using water from the creek and strips torn from her inner dress. They did not speak. There was nothing to say yet. They were running. They were alive. That was enough for now. They rested through the day, taking turns keeping watch, dozing fitfully in the humid heat of the thicket. Jonas dreamed of the whipping tree, of Calloway's face, of the sound the lash made when it connected with flesh. He woke with his heart pounding and Ruth's hand on his shoulder, her finger to her lips. In the distance they could hear dogs, the baying, eager sound of hounds on a scent. The hunt had begun. They waited, barely breathing, as the sounds grew closer. The dogs were following the path they had taken through the woods, following it to the creek. Jonas could hear men's voices now, Samuel among them, his words indistinct, but the anger in his tone unmistakable. The dogs reached the creek and there was confusion. The scent ended at the water. The handlers would spread out, would search both banks, would try to pick up the trail again. Jonas and Ruth pressed themselves against the ground, making themselves as small as possible. The blackberry thicket was dense enough that unless someone pushed directly into it, they would not be visible. Time stretched out. An hour passed. 2. The voices faded, moved downstream instead of up. The dogs were being led away. Jonas allowed himself to breathe. They stayed hidden until nightfall. When full dark came again, they emerged from the thicket, stiff and sore and hungry. They could not risk a fire, so they ate the dried meat and hard bread Ruth had packed, washing it down with creek water. Then they started walking again, north by the stars, putting more miles between themselves and Maryland. The pattern continued for a week. Walk by night, hide by day, avoid roads and towns, drink from streams, eat sparingly, making their supplies last. Jonas's back slowly healed, the wounds crusting over, the pain becoming something he could ignore through sheer will. Ruth's feet developed blisters that burst and bled, and then hardened into calluses. They did not talk much. Talking required energy they needed for walking. On the 8th night, they reached the Pennsylvania border. They knew because Ruth had been counting the days and miles, had been estimating based on the maps she had memorized from descriptions given by other runaways. Pennsylvania was a free state, but that did not mean they were safe. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that slave catchers could cross state lines, could demand that local authorities return escaped enslaved people to their owners. They were still hunted, still property in the eyes of the law, but Pennsylvania also meant the possibility of help. The Underground Railroad was strongest here, with networks of abolitionists and free black people who risked everything to help runaways reach true freedom in Canada. Ruth had 3 names memorized, 3 addresses in 3 different towns. The closest was a Quaker family in a place called Chester Springs. If they could reach that house, if the people there were willing to help, they might have a real chance. They found the house on a rainy night in early October. It was a modest farm, set back from the road, with a barn and a garden and a small orchard. Ruth approached first, Jonas hanging back in the shadows, ready to run if this was a trap. She knocked on the door, 3 quick raps, then 2 slow ones, the signal she had been told about. The door opened a crack and a woman's face appeared, pale in the lamplight. "We're travelers," Ruth said, using the coded language, "looking for the North Star." The woman studied her for a long moment, then opened the door wider. "Come in," she said, quickly. Jonas emerged from the shadows and followed Ruth inside. The house smelled of bread and soap and safety. The woman, she introduced herself simply as Sarah, looked at them with kind, tired eyes. "You're not the first," she said, "and you won't be the last. But you're safe here, for tonight at least." She fed them soup and bread, real food, warm food, more than they had eaten in weeks. She gave them clean clothes and showed them to a hidden room in the cellar, behind a false wall, where they could sleep without fear of slave catchers bursting through the door. As Jonas lay down on an actual mattress with actual blankets, Ruth beside him, he felt something he had not felt since the night of the whipping. He felt human, but he also knew this was temporary. They were not free yet, they were still fugitives, and somewhere behind them, in Maryland, Master Calloway would be recovering from his 10 lashes, planning his revenge, calculating the cost of their escape in his careful ledgers. The distance between them and their former prison was measured in miles, but it could collapse in an instant if they were caught. Freedom was still far away, but for the first time, it felt possible. Morning in Sarah's house felt unreal, like waking up inside someone else's life. Sunlight slipped through the cracks in the cellar door, a soft, golden light that seemed almost embarrassed to fall on people like Jonas and Ruth, who were used to waking under rafters, blackened by smoke and damp. The hidden room was narrow, with low beams and stone walls, but to Jonas it felt cavernous, because it held something he had never known before. Safety that did not belong to a white man's mood. They emerged only when Sarah knocked 3 times, then once, her own small code. She led them up into the kitchen, where a fire already burned in the hearth. The smell of coffee and baking bread wrapped around them like a blanket. Jonas hesitated on the threshold, suddenly aware of his boots leaving traces of red clay on her clean floor, of his presence staining this quiet space with all the violence he carried behind him. Sarah noticed his hesitation and shook her head gently. "There is nothing you can bring into this house that it has not seen before," she said. "Sit, eat." Her husband, Elias, joined them, a tall, thin man with a grey beard and the kind of stillness that comes from long practice at holding strong beliefs in a hostile world. They bowed their heads as he said a simple grace, thanking God for bread, for shelter, and for our guests who walk a hard road toward the freedom they were always meant to have. No mention of slaves, no language of ownership. Jonas felt something tighten in his chest at those words, meant to have, as if freedom were not a prize to be stolen, but a birthright to be reclaimed. They spoke in low voices over breakfast. Sarah did most of the talking. She had a map in her head of routes and safe houses, of sympathetic farms and churches and black communities that would harbor people like Jonas and Ruth for a night, a day, sometimes longer. She talked of coded letters, of quilts hung on lines with certain patterns, of lanterns placed in windows as signals. It was a whole invisible world layered beneath the one Jonas had always known, a world of quiet resistance, of people defying the law and risking prison, fines or death just to move 2 strangers a few miles closer to a border. "You can't stay here long," Elias said. "The law watches our kind closely. Too many visits from patrols, too many questions. We have helped many over the years." His eyes softened with memories he did not share. "But every extra day you remain increases the danger, for you and for us." Ruth leaned forward. "How far to Canada?" Her voice trembled on the last word, as if the country were not just a place but a spell. "Far," Sarah answered honestly. "Weeks yet, maybe longer. You'll go first to a friend of ours near Lancaster, from there on to Philadelphia, then further north to New York. After that, others will guide you. You'll likely cross the border near Niagara, or maybe Detroit. There are ships across the lakes too, if you can reach them." The names washed over Jonas like another language. Lancaster, Philadelphia, Niagara, Detroit. Each one sounded like a step away from Maryland, from Calloway, from the whip and the ledger and the tree. But each one was also a step deeper into danger. More roads, more strangers, more chances to be betrayed. Elias studied Jonas's face. "You've done something," he said quietly. "Something back there that ensures they will not stop looking." Jonas met his gaze and did not look away. There was no point in lying here, not in a house where they had already risked so much. "I put a whip in a master's hand," he said slowly. "Then I made him feel it." Elias's eyes closed briefly, pain and something like respect flickering across his features. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. "Dear Lord," she whispered. "You didn't kill him?" Elias asked. "No," Jonas replied. "I wanted him to live. I wanted him to remember. Then he will burn the country down to find you," Elias said, not unkindly. "Men like that cannot bear to be reminded they are made of the same flesh as those they own." Ruth's fingers tightened around Jonas's. Her voice was very small. "Does that mean we should turn back?" Jonas turned to her so sharply it startled her. "Turn back to what?" he asked. "To the tree? To 40 more lashes? To being sold south because my back can't take any more?" "No, there is no turning back." Sarah nodded. "Forward is the only way now. We knew that when we opened our door to you. We will not pretend otherwise." She fetched a small packet from a drawer, a folded slip of paper sealed with wax. "This is a letter for the next station. You must keep it hidden. If you are stopped, destroy it before anyone can read it. It will tell them who you are and that you can be trusted." Jonas took the letter as if it were a live coal. Trust. The word felt fragile, dangerous. On the plantation, trust had been a weapon used against them. Promises of leniency, threats wrapped in kindness. But here, in this small kitchen, it felt like something else, a rope thrown across a chasm. They left Sarah and Elias's farm at dusk, deeper in their journey than they had been the night before, and yet with miles stretching uncounted ahead. Before they departed, Elias placed his hand briefly on Jonas's shoulder, just above the line where the scars began. "You bear the marks of Pharaoh's lash," he murmured. "But remember, Pharaoh fell, not because one man struck him down, but because a people walked out. You walk for more than yourselves tonight." They moved north again, following faint wagon tracks when they could, slipping into the woods when they heard voices, dogs, or the distant clatter of carriage wheels. The land here rolled in gentle hills, patchworked with farms and stone fences, so different from the flat, humid fields of Maryland. And yet Jonas could not shake the feeling that the whip's shadow still stretched over them, that at any moment the trees might part to reveal Calloway on horseback, the whip in his hand and the law on his side. 2 nights later they approached Lancaster. The town glowed ahead of them, lanterns and lamps spilling light into the streets. Jonas had seen a town only once, when he was 12 and had gone with another boy and a white driver to deliver tobacco. The noise and crush of people had terrified and fascinated him. Now, the prospect of entering such a place as a hunted man felt like walking into a fire. They skirted the edge, keeping to alleys and back lanes. Ruth guided them by memory of Sarah's hurried instructions. "Brick house, green door, 3 steps, round window," she whispered to herself. They passed houses where white families were already asleep, curtains drawn, oblivious to the 2 dark shapes slipping through the night like ghosts. Finally, they found it. A narrow brick house pressed between 2 others, its green door almost black in the weak lamplight. Ruth performed the knock, 3 short, 2 long. A tense pause. Then the door cracked open, and a single dark eye peered out. "You late," a man's voice said, low and steady, with a northern black accent that felt strange and familiar all at once. "Get in then. Don't stand there like a newspaper headline." The man who let them in was black, taller than Jonas, with skin the color of polished mahogany and hair cut close to his scalp. He wore a simple shirt and trousers, but he carried himself with an ease Jonas had never seen in a black man before. Shoulders back, eyes level, fear tucked away somewhere Jonas could not see. "Name's Isaiah," he said. "You can use it. Yours I don't need. Safer that way." He moved with silent efficiency, bolting the door, dousing the lamp in the front room, then leading them to a small interior chamber with no windows. There he lit another lamp, the light enclosing them in a soft circle. "You from Maryland," he said, not asking. "I know that look. S'ain't no other place carves a man up that way." Jonas's hand went unconsciously to his back. Isaiah nodded. "You did something bold by the way the letter talk. That why the patrol's more nosy than usual these days." He gave Jonas a long, measuring look. "You one of them who break and scatter? Some break and never stand again? Some bend? You look like iron that been through the fire and come out harder." Jonas didn't respond. The word stirred something conflicted in him. He had acted out of rage, out of a need to return some small part of what had been done to him. He was no hero, no Moses, just a man who had finally refused to be only a body to be used. Isaiah turned to Ruth. "You hold the stars in your head," he said gently. "You his compass, or he yours?" Ruth's eyes glistened. "Both," she said. Isaiah smiled. "That's the right answer." He pointed to a pallet on the floor. "You rest few hours. Before dawn we move. Track's a little hotter around here. Word is, a big planter down south of here got his back cut open like a field. White folks don't like that story. Makes them nervous. Nervous white folk are like cornered dogs, bite at anything." Jonas lay down, but sleep did not come easily. His mind kept circling around Isaiah's words, around the idea that somewhere, stories about what he had done were traveling faster than he could. Not his name, perhaps, but his act. A master whipped on his own land, by his own property, plantation owners whispering about it in their parlors, glancing over their shoulders at the people who served them their food, suddenly aware that the hands that poured their drinks could also hold a whip. In the darkness, Ruth reached for his hand. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. She did not have to name the it. They both knew. Jonas thought for a long time. He saw Calloway's face not as it had been under the lash, but as it had been every day before, composed, in control, sure of his place in the world. He saw his mother's body lying in the field, his own back stretched on the tree, Ruth on the ground under Samuel's shadow. "No," he said at last. "I regret that I couldn't do it for all of them. For my mother, for yours, for every back that whip ever touched." Ruth squeezed his hand until it hurt. "Then we have to live," she whispered. "We have to live enough life for all of them. Or else, what was the point?" The next phase of their journey was faster, more organized. Isaiah was part of a network that ran through Lancaster into Philadelphia like a hidden river. There were coded notes and wagon compartments with false bottoms, church basements and attics above workshops, where freedmen pretended not to hear the muffled breathing overhead. When strangers knocked at the door, Jonas and Ruth became part of this invisible flow, passengers in a system built on trust and secrecy. In Philadelphia, the scale of freedom stunned Jonas. There were so many black faces, walking openly in the streets, buying bread, arguing politics on corners, that he felt dizzy. Here, black men owned shops, black women ran boarding houses, white and black abolitionists argued in newspapers over tactics and laws, and yet even here, slave catchers prowled, armed with the Fugitive Slave Act and backed by judges willing to declare any black person a runaway on a whisper of evidence. They stayed 2 nights in the cellar of a black church, the pastor giving fiery sermons upstairs about Pharaoh and bondage, while in the darkness beneath, actual fugitives lay on pallets, listening to those words and wondering if God truly heard their footsteps as they crossed this dangerous ground. On the second night, an argument broke out among the men who ran that particular station of the Underground Railroad. Jonas heard it through the thin boards of the floor. "We can't keep sending them all the way to Canada," one voice said, sharp and tired. "We should be fighting here, building something here. Let the South come if they want to drag people back. We'll be ready." "Ready with what?" another man shot back. "Harsh words and empty hands? You want to make them martyrs before they see one free day? Canada ain't perfect, but it's something solid. A place they can't follow. We can't gamble these folks' lives on your temper." Jonas listened, eyes open in the dark. It hit him then that even among the free, even among those who had dedicated their lives to fighting slavery, there was disagreement about what resistance should look like. Some believed in laws and petitions. Some believed in secret routes and border crossings. Some believed in open confrontation. His own act, whipping Calloway, did not fit neatly into any of those categories. It had been personal and symbolic at once, a flash of violence in a system built on centuries of it. Maybe resistance is all of it, he thought. Every piece, every choice. From Philadelphia they were moved again, this time in a wagon full of barrels labeled molasses. The smell was so thick it coated Jonas's throat, making him cough. They lay pressed together in a compartment beneath the barrels, barely enough room to turn their heads. Above them, voices drifted in and out. Toll collectors, curious passers-by. The wagon drivers practiced lies about his cargo and destination. Hours stretched into a blur. At one point, they felt the wagon slow, heard the snap of reins, the clop of another horse beside them, boots on packed earth. Then a harsh voice. "What you got in there?" "Molasses for a merchant in upstate New York," the driver replied casually. "Cold weather coming. Folks want sweet in their tea when the wind turns. Mind if we have a look?" A silence. Jonas felt Ruth's hand find his in the dark, their fingers knitting together like rope. He heard the scrape of wood as a barrel above them was shifted. Liquid sloshed. A bung was pried loose. The sweet, heavy smell intensified. then a low curse. "Damn stuff's leaking. Get it off the road before it ruins half my men's boots. Go on through. Next time, lash 'em tighter." The wagon jerked forward. Only when the sound of the patrol faded did Jonas realize he had been holding his breath. If you're still here following Jonas and Ruth's flight, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. These long, difficult journeys deserve to be remembered step by step, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and how this story resonates with you. Days blurred into weeks. The air grew colder as they moved north. Trees that had been green when they left Maryland turned gold, red, and brown, then began to shed their leaves. Frost rimed the edges of streams in the mornings. Jonas's breath smoked in front of him when they walked at night. Ruth's hands grew raw from cold and constant travel. But there were also moments of strange beauty. A night sky so full of stars it seemed the heavens had spilled open. A pond at dawn, mist coiling above it like something alive. The sound of laughter in a safe house. Other runaways sharing stories of near misses, of help given by strangers who had nothing to gain. In one such house, a small farmhouse in upstate New York, they met a man who changed the way Jonas saw himself. His name was Josiah, a black man in his 50s with hair gone mostly white and hands scarred from work. He had been born free in the North, but had spent his life helping those who were not. "You the one from Maryland," Josiah said, after the local conductor whispered something in his ear. He studied Jonas with an intensity that made Jonas want to look away. "The one who gave his master back a piece of his own medicine." Jonas's jaw tightened. "I'm the one who put my wife in danger," he said flatly. "The one who made hunters ride harder." Josiah shook his head. "You're the one who reminded them they ain't gods. Word of what you did traveled faster than any of us could move. You know what it does to a man hearing that? To a man still bending his back in a field, thinking he got no power at all? It plants something in him. Even if he never lifts a hand, it tells him, you ain't made just to take. That matters." "Stories don't stop whips," Jonas replied. Josiah smiled sadly. "No, but whips don't stop stories either. And sometimes stories make the hand holding the whip tremble. Not enough maybe, not yet, but more than before. You think that doesn't matter? You're wrong." That night, Jonas lay awake for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling. He thought about Calloway, about the scars that would now forever mark the master's back. He thought of field hands leaning on their hoes, whispering about the master in Maryland, who had been tied to a tree and whipped like any other man. He thought of Calloway awakening at night, feeling burning pain in his back, seeing not Jonas's face, but the faces of everyone he had ever punished. For the first time, Jonas allowed himself to imagine that what he had done might reach further than his own life, further than this dangerous march toward the border. It might lodge itself in the hearts of people he would never meet, in places he would never see. That idea scared him and steadied him all at once. Winter was closing in when they reached the last station before Canada, a ramshackle house near the shore of a great grey lake. Wind knifed in from the water, bringing with it the smell of something vast and clean. Jonas had never seen so much water in his life. It seemed to swallow the horizon. Their final guide on American soil was a stern white woman named Margaret, with hair pinned in a tight bun and a gaze that could split stone. "You cross tonight," she said, not wasting words. "Boat'll take you to the other side. Once you step off it, you're in Canada. Law's different there. Doesn't mean life is easy, but no man can claim you as property again. Not legally, anyway." Jonas and Ruth stood on the rocky shore that evening, shivering in the wind. A small rowboat rocked against the pier, its silhouette dark against the slate-colored water. The man who would row them across was bundled in so many layers it was hard to see his face. Ruth slipped her hand into Jonas's. "Can you feel it?" she asked. He nodded slowly. The wind cut through his coat and made his eyes water, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the sense of a threshold. Jav standing with one foot in the world that had made him and the other reaching toward a world that did not yet know what to do with a man like him. Behind them lay Maryland, the Calloway plantation, the tree, the whip, the ledger. Behind them lay his mother's grave and every lash he had ever taken. Ahead lay a country that did not see him as property in law, but that did not yet see him as equal in practice. He would have to build a life from almost nothing. No papers, no trade beyond the work they had forced into his muscles, no guarantees. But he would also have something he had never had before, the right to choose, to work for himself, to love Ruth without fearing she would be sold, to decide how to live with the memories of what he had done and what had been done to him. Margaret's voice cut through the wind. "It's time." Jonas looked at Ruth. She looked back, eyes shining with fear and a fierce, stubborn hope that had carried them all this way. "Together," she said. "Together," he answered. They stepped toward the boat. The boat cut through the dark water with a sound like tearing fabric. Each dip of the oars sent ripples spreading outward into the night, carrying them away from everything they had known. Jonas sat rigid in the bow, his hands gripping the wooden side so hard his knuckles went white. Ruth pressed against him, her body a warm point of contact in the biting cold that rolled off the lake in waves. The man rowing said nothing. His breath came in steady clouds, rhythmic as the pull and push of the oars, and his eyes stayed fixed on the far shore, a line of darkness slightly less dark than the water. Behind them, America receded. Jonas did not look back. He kept his eyes forward, watching that distant shore grow incrementally larger with each stroke. The crossing took an hour, maybe more. Time felt strange out here on the water, suspended between two countries, two lives, two versions of what it meant to be human. The wind carved through his thin coat and found every scar on his back, making them ache as if the whip had only just fallen. He wondered if Calloway felt the same tonight. If the master lay awake in his fine house, his own back throbbing, his mind unable to escape the memory of what it felt like to be powerless. The boat scraped against rocks and jerked to a halt. The oarsman gestured with his chin. "Canada," he said, the first word he had spoken. His voice was rough, worn smooth by weather and secrecy. "You step off here. You're free by law. Don't mean you're safe forever. Don't mean life is easy. But the law can't drag you back, that's something." Jonas climbed out first, his boots slipping on wet stone, then turned to help Ruth. Her hand was cold in his, trembling not from fear, but from the enormity of the moment. They stood on Canadian soil, though it felt like any other rock, any other stretch of shore, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The oarsman was already pushing off, disappearing back into the darkness without ceremony or farewell. His work was done. Theirs was just beginning. They walked inland until they found a cluster of buildings, a small settlement clinging to the lakeshore. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of grey and rose. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere. Everything looked almost painfully ordinary, as if the world had not just split open and rearranged itself. Jonas felt unsteady, like a man stepping onto land after weeks at sea. Freedom, it turned out, had weight. It pressed down on him, demanded things of him he was not sure he knew how to give. A black man emerged from one of the houses, an older man with a limp and eyes that had seen too much. He took one look at Jonas and Ruth, their ragged clothes, their hollow faces, the way they stood too close together like people braced for a blow, and nodded. "You just cross?" he asked. His voice carried an accent Jonas couldn't place, something between American South and something else, something shaped by years in this northern place. "Yes," Ruth answered, when Jonas couldn't find words. "Come on then. You'll want food, rest. There's others here like you. We help each other." He gestured toward his house. "Name's Samuel." "I know. Same as overseers and slave catchers. My mama had a sense of humor." A brief, bitter smile. "Been here 7 years now, came up from Virginia. You get used to the cold eventually. The rest takes longer." Inside Samuel's house there were 3 other people, 2 men and a woman, all black, all with the same haunted, watchful look that Jonas recognized from mirrors and from the faces in the quarters back in Maryland. They sat around a rough wooden table, eating porridge and drinking weak tea. Samuel's wife, a quiet woman named Abigail, ladled out bowls for Jonas and Ruth without asking questions. The food was simple but warm, and Jonas ate mechanically, barely tasting it, his mind still caught somewhere in the crossing. "You did something back there," one of the men said suddenly. He was young, maybe 20, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. "Something that got you running hard." "I can tell." Jonas looked up, met the man's eyes. There was no judgment in them, only recognition. "I put my hands on a master," he said quietly. Put a whip in his hand, made him feel it. The room went silent. Then the woman, elderly, with hair gone completely white, let out a long breath. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "You the one from Maryland, we heard stories. Thought maybe they was exaggerated the way stories get, but you really did it." "I really did it," Jonas confirmed. The young man with the scar leaned forward. "And you lived, and you here. That means something." He paused. "Means he didn't break you." Jonas thought about that, about breaking, about all the ways a person could be broken, and all the ways they could refuse to break. "He tried," Jonas said. "They all tried. But some things, once you decide they won't break, they don't, no matter how hard they hit." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's the truth of it. That's what they don't understand. They think pain is the end of the conversation, but sometimes pain is just the beginning." They talked through the morning, these survivors of the same war, sharing stories that were both different and the same. Stories of escape, of close calls, of people left behind and people lost along the way. Stories of what it meant to build a life in a place that was technically free but still hostile, where white Canadians looked at them with suspicion or pity, where work was hard to find and harder to keep, where winter could kill as surely as any slave catcher. But there were also stories of hope, of small communities forming, of churches and schools being built, of children born free who would never know chains, of people learning to read and write, to own land, to vote. It was not paradise. It was not even close, but it was a beginning. And beginnings were more than Jonas had ever been allowed before. Over the following weeks, Jonas and Ruth settled into a pattern. They found work. Jonas as a laborer on the docks, loading and unloading ships, Ruth taking in laundry and mending. The work was hard, the pay meager and the winter brutal in ways that Maryland had never prepared them for, but it was work they chose, work they could walk away from if they wanted, work that earned them money they could spend how they wished. These small freedoms, Jonas discovered, were almost overwhelming in their cumulative weight. He bought Ruth a new dress with his first wages. It was not fancy, plain brown cotton, practical and warm, but it was hers, chosen by her, paid for with money he had earned. She cried when he gave it to her, and he understood. It was not about the dress. It was about what the dress represented, a life where they could make choices, where they could think beyond survival to something that resembled living. They rented a small room in a boarding house run by a freed woman named Patience, who had come to Canada 20 years earlier and built a life through sheer stubbornness. She was a large woman with a voice that could carry across a crowded room and a laugh that sounded like it had survived everything the world could throw at it. She took one look at Jonas and Ruth and quoted them half the usual rent. "You pay the rest when you can," she said, "and if you can't, we figure something out. That's how we do things here. We take care of our own." Jonas struggled with that phrase, our own. He had spent his entire life being owned but never belonging. The idea that there was a we that included him, that would catch him if he fell, was foreign and frightening and necessary all at once. The nightmares came regularly. Jonas would wake in the dark, his back on fire, convinced he was still tied to the tree, still counting lashes. Ruth would hold him until the shaking stopped, until he remembered where he was. Sometimes she had her own nightmares, dreams of being caught, of slave catchers dragging her back across the border, of losing Jonas to the violence that had defined so much of their lives. They learned to comfort each other in the dark, to be each other's anchor when memory tried to pull them under. Winter deepened. Snow came in waves, burying the settlement under white that made everything look clean and new, even though Jonas knew better. He learned to walk on ice without falling, to wrap his feet in extra layers of cloth inside his boots, to keep moving even when the cold made his bones ache. Ruth learned to navigate the settlement's small market, to bargain for food, to stretch their meager resources across the long weeks between paydays. And slowly, almost without noticing, they began to build something, not just a life, but a community. They attended services at the small church, where a fiery black preacher named Reverend Thompson delivered sermons about Moses and Pharaoh, about Exodus and promised lands, his words drawing explicit connections between ancient scripture and present struggle. Jonas listened and felt something shift in him. He had never been religious in the way his mother had been, but here, in this rough wooden church filled with people who had walked similar roads, the old stories took on new meaning. One Sunday after service, Reverend Thompson pulled Jonas aside. "I hear you're the one from Maryland," he said quietly, "the one who put the whip in the master's hand." Jonas tensed, waiting for judgment, but the Reverend simply nodded. "Some would say you were wrong. That violence begets violence, that we must be better than them. I don't know if they're right or wrong, but I know this. You reminded people that we are human, that we can fight back, that we are not just bodies to be used. That matters, brother. That matters more than you know." "It got people hurt," Jonas said. "There were consequences for people I left behind." "There are always consequences," Reverend Thompson replied, "for acting and for not acting, for resisting and for submitting. You chose your consequences. That's all any of us can do." Spring came slowly, cautiously, like something that had forgotten how to arrive. The snow retreated, mud appeared. Then grass, tentative and green. Birds returned, filling the mornings with sound. Jonas and Ruth planted a small garden behind the boarding house, tomatoes, beans, herbs, and watched with something like wonder as things they had planted with their own hands began to grow. Ruth discovered she was pregnant in late spring. The knowledge hit them both like a lightning strike. A child. A free child. A child who would never be listed in a ledger. never be valued as property, never be sold. The weight of that realization made Jonas sit down hard, his hands shaking. Ruth cried, her hands pressed to her still flat belly, and Jonas held her, both of them overwhelmed by the enormity of bringing a new life into a world that was still so uncertain. "What if we can't protect them?" Ruth whispered. "What if—" "We will," Jonas interrupted, though he had no idea how to make that promise real. "We will because we have to, because that's what it means to be free. We get to try, we get to fail, we get to try again." News from the south filtered north, through letters, through travelers, through the underground networks that still operated. Jonas learned that the Callaway plantation had not fallen apart in his absence, that the system had simply absorbed his departure and continued. Samuel had been promoted to head overseer. 2 new people had been purchased to replace Jonas and Ruth. Life went on, which somehow felt worse than if everything had collapsed. His act of resistance had been real, had mattered, but it had not unmade the machine. The machine was too large, too entrenched. But there were also other stories, stories of more runaways, stories of small rebellions. A barn burned here, tools broken there, work slowed to a crawl until overseers raged themselves hoarse. Stories of whispered conversations in quarters across the south, conversations that invoked the name of that man in Maryland who had whipped his master. The stories had grown in the telling, become mythic, and Jonas barely recognized himself in them. But he understood their function. They were seeds, planted in minds that had been taught they were powerless. Some seeds would die, but some would grow. Summer arrived in full, hot and lush. Jonas's back no longer hurt constantly, though the scars pulled when he stretched, a permanent reminder of what he had survived. He worked steadily, saved money, and began to think about the future in ways he had never been allowed to before. He and Ruth talked about buying land someday, about building a house, about giving their child, and maybe more children, a life defined not by what had been taken from them, but by what they could build. One evening in late August, exactly a year after the night he had tied Callaway to the tree, Jonas walked down to the lake shore alone. The water was calm, reflecting the pink and orange of sunset. He stood there for a long time, thinking about time and distance and the strange paths that had brought him to this shore. He thought about his mother, about whether she would be proud or horrified by what he had done. He thought about Callaway, wondering if the master's scars had healed, if he still woke at night feeling phantom pain, if he looked at his enslaved workers differently now. He thought about the whip, which he had left lying on Callaway's chest. He wondered what had become of it. Had Callaway kept it as a reminder? Had he burned it in rage? Had he hung it back on his wall and pretended nothing had changed? Jonas would never know. That chapter of his life was closed, separated from him by hundreds of miles and an international border, but it was not forgotten. The scars on his back ensured that. The nightmares ensured that. The child growing in Ruth's belly, who would be born free because Jonas and Ruth had been willing to risk everything, ensured that. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Ruth approaching, her hand resting on her belly where their child grew. She came to stand beside him, looking out at the water. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything," Jonas said. "Nothing. I don't know." She took his hand. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Jonas was quiet for a long time, watching the sun sink lower, watching the light change. "I regret the people I left behind," he said finally. "I regret that my freedom came at a cost to others. But the act itself? No. Someone had to remind him. Someone had to show that we're not just animals to be corrected, that we remember, that we can choose to fight back, even knowing what it might cost." "And was it worth it?" Ruth pressed. "The running, the fear, the cold, the uncertainty, all of it. Was it worth it?" Jonas turned to face her, his hand moving to join hers on her belly. "Ask me again," he said, "when we're holding our child, when we're watching them grow up free, when we're old and sitting on our own porch on our own land. Ask me then." Ruth smiled, tears in her eyes. "I already know what you'll say. Yeah. You'll say it was worth every step." Jonas pulled her close and they stood together on the shore as the sun set on their first year of freedom. Behind them, in the small settlement that had become home, lamps were being lit in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. The sounds of evening, voices, laughter, a baby crying drifted on the wind. It was an ordinary evening, in an ordinary place, which made it extraordinary, because for the first time in their lives, they were part of that ordinary world. They belonged to it and to themselves. The story of Jonas of Maryland would continue to spread through the South, growing with each telling, inspiring some and terrifying others. The man himself would never know the full extent of his legend. He would simply live, work, build, raise children, grow old. He would have good days and hard days, would struggle with the ghosts of his past, would build a life that was never perfect, but was always his own. Years later, long after the Civil War had finally broken the chains Jonas had fled, long after slavery was abolished, and the world had changed in ways both profound and insufficient, an old man would sit on the porch of a modest house on land he owned, watching his grandchildren play in a yard that belonged to them by right rather than by permission. His back would still carry the scars of Calloway's whip, and his hands would still sometimes shake when he heard certain sounds, but he would also carry something else, the knowledge that he had chosen his own path, that he had refused to be only what others tried to make him, that he had taught his children and grandchildren that resistance takes many forms, and that survival is only the beginning, not the end. And on quiet nights, when the wind came off the lake and the stars blazed overhead, he would remember a September night in Maryland, a whip in his hand and a master tied to a tree, learning what it meant to be powerless. He would remember it not with satisfaction or regret, but simply as a moment when he had chosen to be human in a system designed to make him less than human. That moment had cost him everything he knew and given him everything he had. It was the hinge on which his entire life had turned. If you followed Jonas and Ruth's journey to the end, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with others who need to hear about resistance, survival, and the long road to freedom. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what this story means to you. These histories matter. These voices deserve to be heard. And stories like Jonas's remind us that even in the darkest systems, individuals find ways to assert their humanity and fight for their freedom. The scars remain. The memory remains. But so does the freedom, hard-won and precious, that came from refusing to be broken. That is the legacy of Jonas of Maryland. Not just a man who whipped his master, but a man who chose to live free or die trying, and who built a life on the other side of that choice.